largest minority groups, the Kurds. We're talking about a people with a long and incredibly rich history.
All right, let's just jump right in. The big question is this. What do Iran's 10 million Kurds really want? Is it one single thing? Or is the answer, as you might guess, a whole lot more complicated than that? Okay, so before we can even begin to answer that, we've got to understand who we're talking about. So let's start with the absolute basics. Who are the Iranian Kurds?
First off, let's just get a sense of the scale here. We're not talking about a small community at all. We're talking about a population of somewhere around 9 to 10 million people. That makes them a huge and historically very significant minority inside Iran. So where do they live? Well, they're mostly concentrated in the western part of Iran, in a region they themselves call Rojhilat Kurdistane, which basically means Eastern Kurdistan. This area covers 5 main provinces, and, this is super important, it borders both Iraq and Turkey. Just tuck that detail away because we're definitely going to circle back to it.
And here's where things get another layer of complexity. You see, the Kurds aren't a religious monolith, not at all. A lot of them are Sunni Muslims, sure, but there's also a big Shia population, and even followers of a faith called Yarsanism. And believe me, this diversity is absolutely key to understanding their identity and their politics. All right, so now that we've got that foundation laid, let's rewind a bit. Because to really get what people want today, you have to dig into the past. We've got to explore the historical roots of Kurdish nationalism right there in Iran. A lot of people might think Kurdish nationalism started somewhere else, maybe in the Ottoman Empire. But the historical sources, they actually point to Iranian Kurdistan as the ideological cradle, the real intellectual birthplace of the whole movement. It's where those first ideas of a shared, unified Kurdish identity started to bubble up and take form. And look, this nationalism didn't just pop up out of nowhere. The sources are pretty clear. It was a direct reaction to state policies, especially something called Persianization. Basically, as Iranian rulers pushed Persian as the only official language, it pushed a lot of Kurds away. It sparked this counter-movement to hold on to their own culture, their own language, and their own identity.
And this timeline, wow, it just lays it all out, doesn't it? You can see this clear, consistent pattern of political action stretching over decades. I mean, it goes from their language being excluded way back in 1905 to major rebellions to even declaring their own, albeit very short-lived, republic in a city called Mahabad. This isn't a new thing. It's a long, persistent, historical struggle for self-determination.
Okay, but this story isn't just about what happens inside Iran's borders. Not by a long shot. Remember that geography I told you to tuck away? Well, here's where it comes back in a huge way, in this cross-border struggle. See, there's this really strong sense of ethnic connection that goes right across those national borders. So something happening with the Kurds in Turkey or Iraq, it would create a direct ripple effect for Kurds in Iran and the other way around. A rebellion over here could totally inspire or even support a movement over there. Those lines on the map, they just couldn't contain that powerful sense of a shared identity. And man, this slide shows just how complicated and, well, messy those alliances could get. Before the Iranian Revolution in 1979, you had this really strong cross-border support system. But politics, it makes for some strange bedfellows, right? Alliances shifted like crazy. At one point, you had an Iraqi Kurdish group actually teaming up with Iran's own intelligence agency against the Iraqi government. Then, after '79, everything changed again. The focus shifted inward, and you saw these Iranian Kurdish groups starting to fight amongst themselves for power. Okay, so that all brings us closer to the modern day. How is this really long, drawn-out conflict actually defined today, by the state, by outside observers? Well, officially, it's called the Kurdish-Iranian conflict, and it's often described as one of the longest-running separatist disputes in the entire region, kicking off way back in 1918. That's how it's framed, a struggle between Kurdish opposition groups and Iran's central government. But here's a really interesting twist you find in the source material. Back during the 1979 revolution, widespread calls for autonomy, they weren't really a huge thing. This big surge in nationalist feeling that we see today is actually a much more recent development. It really started to gain steam in the 1990s. So why then? What caused that recent explosion of nationalism? Well, the sources suggest that a huge driver was a direct reaction to the government's own actions. specifically a feeling of outrage over the violent crackdown on Kurdish activism. And that created this vicious cycle, right? The government's actions ended up fueling the very thing it was trying to stamp out. Which brings us all the way back to where we started. We've got the history, we've got the geography, we've got the political context. So can we finally answer that big question? After all this, what do the Kurds in Iran really want? Yeah, after everything we've just walked through, you can probably guess the answer isn't going to be a simple, neat little soundbite. It's every bit as complex as the history that created it. So here's the deal. The answer is really a spectrum. There is no one thing they want. For some, the goal is getting more cultural and political rights within the existing state of Iran. For others, it's nothing less than full independence, full separatism. And every single one of these goals, all along that spectrum, is rooted in that deep, complex history we just looked at. The Persianization policies, those shifting alliances, and that constant evolving struggle with the central government. And that leaves us with one last, kind of provocative thought to chew on. The Kurds are a people whose identity doesn't stop at the borders of Iran or Iraq or Turkey or Syria. And that forces us to ask a really fundamental question. For a people spread across 4 different nations, what does a line on a map really